Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi argues that President Bush and his administration are responsible for murdering thousands of U.S. soldiers and over 100,000 Iraqi civilians. Mr. Bugliosi says that by taking the country to war under knowingly false pretenses, President Bush has committed the most serious crime in U.S. history. This event is 2 hours.
And now it is my great honor to first tell you about some other events that are coming up that I would like you to join us at. We have on Wednesday, July 2nd, 7 o'clock, for Progressive Democrats of America and their friends. We will also be televised on C-SPAN. The hosts are Gene and Tony Pritzker, and the author Christopher Cerf of Mission Accomplished, or How We Won the War in Iraq. You know we did win that, right? Yeah, all right. All right. He will be speaking, and we hope that you can all join us for that as well. Lydia Cornell of Progressive Democrats of America will be the moderator. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Vincent Bugliosi. Vincent Bugliosi received his law degree in 1964. In his career at the LA County District Attorney's Office, he successfully prosecuted 105 out of 106 felony jury trials. Pretty good record, yeah? Including 21 murder convictions without a single loss. He's the man to prosecute George Bush. And Dick Cheney and Wolfowitz. His most famous trial, the Charles Manson case, became the basis of his classic Helter Skelter, the biggest-selling true crime book in publishing history. Two of Bugliosi's other books, And the Sea Will Tell and Outrage, also reached #1 on the New York Times hardcover bestseller list. No other American true crime writer has ever had more than one book that achieved this ranking. His latest book, before this one, Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, has been heralded as an epic and a book for the ages. And so I think we are in good company tonight with a prosecutor with a record like that. Vincent Bugliosi, come on up, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. You're making me feel very important, and I'm not important. I'm just a very ordinary person who's very, very angry. I want to thank you so much for coming here tonight to hear me talk about my book, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. You can't hear? What do I do to make you be able to hear? I have to lean more? Let's see here. Can you hear me now? You still can't hear? Well, they could hear you, Marcy. I don't know what happened here. Pardon? Well, you're going to have to turn up the volume. I have to have room for my pages here. Can you hear me in the back now? Oh, you can now. Okay, good, good. The problem is that there's supposed to be room for this, okay? I told them when I came here and I said, make room for some pages, and they said, well, we are, but now I got to compete with this thing right here. But you can hear me now, you think? Okay, good. I was saying thank you for coming here to hear me talk tonight about my book, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. Now, I realize the title of my book is a little bit ambiguous, and some people have chided me for not being a little more clear about my intentions. Before I go any further, I do want to thank someone who's already been named tonight, but I want to mention her again, the woman who's responsible, primarily responsible for this event tonight, someone who is a very important and highly respected figure in Democratic progressive circles here in LA and the Southland, and someone who I have just learned a couple days ago, behind the scenes and without my awareness, has selflessly devoted an enormous amount of time to getting out the message of my book to the people of this country, and that's Eileen Proctor. Please give her a big hand. Could someone bring up a copy of my book? Okay. I've been so busy today. Thank you very much. I've been up since 5 o'clock, which is not that early, but if you go to bed at 2 o'clock, 5's a little early. Been very, very busy since the book came out. In my book, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder, I present evidence that proves beyond all reasonable doubt that George Bush took this nation to war on a lie, under false pretenses, and therefore under the law. He is guilty of murder for the deaths of over 4,000 young American soldiers who died so far in his war. You notice I said his war, not your war, not my war, not America's war, but George Bush's war. Now, I realize, I'm fully aware that the charge I've just made is an extremely serious one, but if there's one thing about me that I do take pride in, I never, ever, ever make a charge without making or offering a substantial amount of support for that charge. You may end up disagreeing with what I say, but you're going to be forced to concede, or you're going to have to concede, that I offer much evidence in support of my position, something that people don't always do. How often, for instance, do you see an assertive, declarative headline in a newspaper article, and then you read the article, and either there's no support for the headline or the support is very anemic? I don't do that. That's not my style. By the way, I assume that most of you folks here tonight are Democrats. I think you are, and therefore most of the things I'll be saying tonight, you'll be partial to what I'm saying. But C-SPAN is also televising this. I think it's going to be taped. It'll be shown 3-4 days from now. In any event, there'll be people watching on C-SPAN who may not be partial to what I'm saying. So therefore, my remarks tonight are going to be delivered as if I were speaking to a more politically diverse audience, not just the people here in this room. I have long believed that most humans only see what they expect to see, what they want to see, what conventional wisdom tells them to see, not what is right in front of them in its pristine condition. In other words, they only hear the music, not the lyrics of human events. And in this regard, if any of you find it intellectually incongruous and therefore difficult to accept that a president of the United States could do what I say George Bush did, because, well, one would never expect a United States president to do such a thing, in other words, seeing what you expect to see, I say that you will be falling into the same unthinking trap that so many humans do. You have to disabuse yourself of any preconceived notion that you may have that just because George Bush is the President of the United States, he is simply incapable of engaging in conduct that smacks of such great criminality. Because if you take that position, a position that has no foundation in logic, you're not going to be as receptive to the evidence that I present or the common sense inferences I draw from that evidence. For those skeptics who say that to prosecute, I knew this was going to happen, that's why I told them. I told them 3-4 times. Anyway, for those skeptics who say that to prosecute George Bush for murder, to prosecute any American president for murder who takes this nation to war, and to do so in a regular American courtroom, and in the very same way that in some adjacent courtroom, a criminal defendant is being prosecuted for murdering a liquor store proprietor during the perpetration of a robbery, is just too revolutionary a notion to be viable. I say this: since a regular courtroom is the only place a president such as Bush can be prosecuted for murder, you therefore, if you take that position, if you maintain that position, you must be willing to say then that if a president takes this nation to war under false pretenses, even those hypothetically as base as for his own personal gain, and thousands of Americans get killed, 50 million Americans are killed, other than removing him from office through the impeachment process, he should be completely immune from all criminal responsibility and punishment, not even one day in the county jail, and should be able to go on with his life. Now, unless you are willing to say this, and if you do, you're going to sound awfully foolish, then you likewise must learn to accept and live with this revolutionary notion. Why? Because there's no third alternative. So although Bush supporters can argue that Bush should not be prosecuted because they don't think he did anything wrong, they cannot legitimately say that he should not be prosecuted if he has done what I say he did. To say that is to admit that you have no respect at all for our American system of justice and democracy, that you would prefer that presidents have the same rights and protections as tyrannical dictators like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Saddam Hussein. I want to state that in writing this book, my motivation was not political. Whether I'm giving a final summation to the jury or writing one of my true crime books, credibility has always meant everything to me. Therefore, my only master, my only mistress are the facts and objectivity. And this is why I can give you a 100% guarantee that if a Democratic president had done what I'm very, very convinced that George Bush did, I would have written the same identical book. Before I get into some of the law, applicable to this case and some of the irrefutable evidence that Bush could not get around at his trial, I'd like to touch on some preliminary matters. One is that although millions, perhaps billions, of very harsh, highly condemnatory words have been said and written about George Bush throughout the past 7 years, none of which, by the way, he could possibly care any less about. So the words are meaningless. Up to now, other than talk, no one has done anything at all, anything to George Bush. No impeachment, no investigation of him, nothing. He's gotten off scot-free so far. But in my book, I put together a legal case against Bush that could result in his being prosecuted for first-degree murder in an American courtroom. He has temporary immunity right now, but once he leaves office, there's no question about it, the United States Constitution goes all the way back to the Federalist Papers, 1787, Alexander Hamilton. Once a president leaves office, he can be prosecuted for any crimes he committed while he was in office. In the book, I set forth the legal architecture for the case against Bush, the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, and the jurisdiction to prosecute him. In talking on radio shows around the country from my home here in Los Angeles, the hosts and the people calling in, the callers, can probably be broken down in a general way into three broad categories. One is the group like I assume you folks are, who would fall into, the group that I assume is fairly supportive, you've already indicated that, of what I'm trying to do. The second group is the group that could be exemplified by this type of composite caller, whether I'm talking in Portland, Miami, or wherever. Mr. Bugliosi, I've read many of your books, I've always respected you, but have you lost your marbles? What in the world are you talking about? You're talking about prosecuting a president for murder who takes this nation to war? That's just crazy. Now, the first question I ask these people, have you read the book? The automatic answer, no. I have yet to talk to one person who has read this book, or heard from one person who's read this book, who thinks that there's anything crazy about this book. But those that haven't, they think it's just very, very far out. In this regard, I think I have a certain reputation as a prosecutor and a certain amount of credibility in the area of the criminal law. And with this in mind, I would never in a million years throw all that out the window, never in a million years propose prosecuting George Bush for murder unless I thought I had all the evidence that I needed to convict him and unless I felt that I was standing on very firm, solid legal ground. But well, some of you may have already read the book, and I think you've already seen that this is not a, academic, theoretical legal treatise. This is a practical, nuts and bolts legal blueprint for prosecuting George Bush for murder. But I'm running into the notion in many places from people who haven't read the book that what I'm proposing is bizarre, radical. For instance, although I don't have a computer, people send me stuff on the internet now and then. And a couple weeks ago, I got something, a printout, I guess, from Amazon.com, and in Amazon.com, this book was ranked in sales #1, just above Marx, Lenin, and Machiavelli. A lovely group to be associated with. But what I say in my book may be new and revolutionary, but there's nothing radical about it. In fact, this book here is identical to every other single true crime book that I've ever written. I present the evidence and the applicable law to prove my case. A Phoenix radio station host told me a few weeks ago that when several employees saw this book on his desk, they came over with their cell phones and started taking photographs of the cover of the book, as if it was just so far out. So there's this sense out there among many that prosecuting Bush for murder can't be done, which is the equivalent of saying what? That he's above the law, that ordinary laws simply don't apply to him. In fact, recently, State Attorney General, I'm not going to tell you which one it is, call him Sam, that's not his real name, calls me at my home, I think it was not this Sunday, but last Sunday afternoon. He said, Vince, I hear you have a book out there taking on George Bush. You're talking about impeachment? And I said, Sam, no. I'm talking about murder, prosecuting him for murder. And Sam said to me, these are his exact words, under what law? Now, mind you, the State Attorney General is the chief legal officer in every state, the chief law enforcement officer in every state, and he's asking me under what law? And I said to him, Sam, under the law that's already on the books in all 50 states, and federally, U.S. Code, Title 18, Section 1111. And I said, Sam, as you know, there's no federal or state murder statute that says that it only applies to certain people, not to presidents or engineers or hairstylists or what have you, and only when the killing takes place in a certain place, like a car, a home, out in the street, not a battlefield. And of course, all he could say was, well, that's true. The third group of people responding to my book is the nation's right wing. And they, of course, have contempt for me in my book. But whatever contempt they have for me, I can assure them and I can assure you I have much, much, much more contempt for them. There are no more repugnant, hypocritical, and un-American, that's the word I want to emphasize, un-American people in our society today than the right wing. I'll just give you one example. I could give you many more. When it was their time to fight for America in the Vietnam War, virtually all of them, I'm talking about people like Cheney, Rove, that endlessly reprehensible Rush Limbaugh. What did they do? I'll tell you what they did. They ran like hell in the opposite direction. But today they have no hesitancy at all in waving the flag. They don't want to fight for it, but waving the flag and shedding the blood of other people's children in the Iraq War. As far as Bush's monumental crime in this case is concerned, I'm going to give you a fact. It's not an opinion. It's a fact, because I know these people. As far as his monumental crime in this case is concerned, since Bush is a conservative Republican, and so are they, anything he does, anything at all, including murder, is just fine with them, just fine. God, these are despicable human beings. I have nothing but contempt for them. But you know, although I was perhaps maybe a tough prosecutor, I was always very, very, very fair. And there's one thing that I should probably say in partial defense of these people that goes in mitigation, arguably reduces their moral culpability. And what I'm talking about is that many of these people are incredibly stupid. And they make up for their stupidity by being extremely ignorant. And when you combine stupidity with ignorance, that's a toxic combination. But I do want to be fair to these people. There are several legal complexities in this case, some rather arcane, all of which I discuss in a fair amount of depth in my book. But tonight I'm only going to talk about one of these issues. People are asking me, how could George Bush be prosecuted for murder when he didn't personally kill anyone? Of course, the answer is that you don't have to personally kill someone if you're a criminal defendant to be guilty of murder. Charles Manson, you know about him. I convicted him of the 7 Tate LaBianca murders, even though he didn't physically participate in the murders. He wasn't even present at the murder scene, not like O.J. Simpson. Well, not only was Simpson's blood, his fresh blood, found at the murder scene, but the victim's blood was found inside his car and home. And under those circumstances, to deny guilt is the equivalent of a man being caught by his wife in flagrante delicto with another woman and saying to her, quoting comedian Richard Pryor, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" I was able to convict Manson because of the vicarious liability rule of conspiracy, which provides that each conspirator is criminally responsible for all crimes committed by his co-conspirators, as well as innocent agents of those conspirators to further the object of the conspiracy. E.g., A and B conspire to commit a bank robbery, and A is the driver of the getaway car, B's the stick-up guy, he goes in, the teller resists, and B kills the teller. A, sitting down in his car, is guilty of that murder, even though he only conspired to commit robbery. Why? Because B murdered the teller to further the object of the conspiracy. That's the law of the land. But, one might say, since even Bush's co-conspirators, like Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, did not kill the victims who would be named in the criminal indictment in this case, the 4,000 American soldiers who have died so far in Iraq, Iraqi soldiers and civilian insurgents did, how could he be guilty of murder? The reason is that if a conspirator, or anyone for that matter, deliberately sets in motion a chain of events which he knows will cause, that's the key word, will cause a third-party innocent agent to commit an act, the defendant is criminally responsible for that act. Bush, in invading Iraq, caused Iraqis to kill American soldiers in much the same fashion that a person causes a gun to fire a bullet that kills someone by pulling the trigger. In fact, in the criminal law, innocent agents are referred to as mere instruments of the defendant. For George Bush to say that he's not responsible at all for the killings in this case would almost be the same as a conspirator arguing, my co-conspirator never killed the victim, his gun did. Here we all know that the object of Bush, Cheney, and Rice was to go to war in Iraq, which they knew would inevitably result in American soldiers dying, unless Bush wants to make the argument, which would be rejected completely out of hand, that he was planning some type of war without casualties. And as the courts have said, quote, the doctrine of innocent agent allows a defendant not present at the commission of a crime, here are the killings in Iraq, to be convicted as a principal in the first degree if the defendant engaged in actions which caused, there's that word caused again, which caused the actual perpetrator to do the act as an innocent agent of the defendant. Note that it does not have to be shown that the principal wanted the innocent agent to commit the act, only that he caused him to. And certainly in invading Iraq, Bush caused Iraqis, either in self-defense or to repel an invader, to fight back. Now, Cindy Sheehan called me this Sunday at my home, and during our conversation, at one point, she said these words. And she didn't get these words from law school, nor from reading that part of the book. She's reading the book, but she hadn't read yet, she hadn't come to the part where I'm talking about the innocent agent doctrine. These are her exact words. She's just common sense. Cindy said, quote, the Iraqi insurgents did not kill my son, George Bush did. They were just repelling an invader, which they had every right to do. That's Cindy Sheehan. Under federal law, the innocent agent doctrine is codified. Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 2B, provides, quote, whoever willfully causes an act to be done which, if directly performed by him, would be a crime is punishable as a principle. The courts have held that the defendant, quote, is as guilty as if he had done the act himself, unquote. In other words, we can all agree that if George Bush killed an American soldier, he'd be guilty of murder. He cannot immunize himself from criminal responsibility by deliberately and knowingly causing a third party to do the killing. He's still responsible. George Bush cannot sit safely in his Oval Office in Washington, D.C., while young American soldiers are being blown to pieces by roadside bombs in Iraq, and as he would so much like to do, wash his hands of all culpability. It's not quite that easy. And I'm very confident that if an American jury hears the evidence in this case against George Bush, when they come back into that courtroom with their verdict of guilty, they will tell George Bush, it's not quite that easy. Bush could only wash his hands of culpability if he did not take this nation to war under false pretenses. If he did, which the evidence overwhelmingly shows. He's criminally responsible for the deaths of all those American soldiers who have died fighting his war in Iraq. In addition to the vicarious liability theory of conspiracy, Bush is also criminally responsible for the deaths of the 4,000 American soldiers under the separate and independent legal theory of aiding and abetting. Very briefly, one is guilty of a crime under the theory of aiding and abetting if he either, it's in the disjunctive, either instigates the commission of the offense. In the law, to instigate is to, quote, stimulate or goad to action, especially a bad action, or assist the actual perpetrator in the commission of the offense. Here, Bush clearly instigated the killings of American soldiers in Iraq by invading Iraq, and therefore that in itself would make him guilty of murder under the separate and independent legal theory of aiding and abetting. Let me tell you that the things I've just discussed with you would all only be peripheral legal issues at George Bush's trial. Let me tell you what the main legal overriding issue would be at Bush's trial if he were ever prosecuted. The main issue would be whether or not George Bush went to war, as he has always claimed, in self-defense, his so-called preemptive strike. Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, allegedly so. Therefore, he was an imminent threat to the security of this country, so Bush had to strike first in self-defense. If the war was not in self-defense, but one that the prosecutor could prove, Bush took us to under false pretenses, then all of the killings of American soldiers in Iraq become unlawful killings and therefore murder. Let me give you some of the main pieces of evidence against Bush showing he took this nation to war under false pretenses. In my book, I offer many, many more. And by the way, during this discussion and the rest of my speech tonight, many of my words are going to be somewhat harsh. At one point, I will use a profanity because that's the word that I used at the time. They say that when you get older, you're supposed to get more mellow, but with me, it seems to be the opposite. No, I'm telling you the truth. I seem to be getting more angry and acerbic and caustic. And that's because I'm always in a state of rage. How can I help but be? How can I help but be? The monstrous, grotesque, obscene Ken Starr almost destroyed the Clinton presidency over absolutely nothing while being totally and completely supported and funded by the federal government. They funded his 7-year, $70 million effort, the federal government. And the so-called liberal media, New York Times, savaging Clinton on a day-to-day basis, supporting this monstrous, grotesque, obscene figure, one of the most reprehensible figures in American history, Ken Starr. The U.S. Supreme Court in 2000, stopping the recount in Florida, which was specifically authorized by Florida law, taking the election away from the American people and appointing George Bush president, one of the biggest crimes in American history. I wrote the book on it, right. I remember I could not sleep that night. Could not sleep, and I got out of bed around 4 in the morning and in a state of rage, and I scratched out about 2,000 words. And I called Victor Navasky, longtime publisher of the Nation. I had never met Victor, but I'd spoken to him a couple times. I knew of him, and I knew that no other magazine in America, no mainstream magazine, was about to publish what I wanted to say. And I remember my words, and I remember his words. I said, Victor, I want you to step up to the plate. I said, we can't let these people get by with it. I want you to step up to the plate and publish what I'm going to write. He said, Vince, he said, I'm aboard. Try to keep it down to 3,500 words. And I said, Victor, I can't say hello in 3,500 words. I ended up writing 7,000 words. None dare call it treason. And to Victor's credit, he published all 7,000 words. And according to the people at the Nation, it got the biggest response from their readers in the 136-year history of the Nation, going all the way back to 1865, the last year of the Civil War. And now this, I'm talking about why I'm always in a state of rage. this terribly defective, perhaps even amoral human being, George Bush, taken this nation to war on a lie, and as a direct result, 4,000 young American soldiers have come home in flag-draped aluminum boxes, and since around 70% of all combat deaths in Iraq are from roadside bombs, listen to this, sometimes it's their only child, 18 years old, 19 years old, they live through him vicariously, comes back in a box, and the Department of Defense tells the parents, don't open the box because the contents are, quote, unviewable, unquote. That's a term that the military uses. And let's not forget the over 100,000. Some estimates put the amount at over 1 million. I'm using a very, very conservative number when I say over 100,000. Let's not forget the over 100,000 innocent Iraqi men, women, children, and babies who have died horrible, violent deaths because of this man right here, George W. Bush. I went off on a tributary. I'm glad I have notes, because when you get older, you go off on a tributary and you forget where you were. But I've always subscribed to an old Chinese proverb that the palest ink is better than the best memory, so I've got my notes here. We were talking about the evidence against Bush. And as I discuss some of this evidence, you might be very interested to know, I think you are going to be interested to know, that this is the same evidence that prompted a very conservative Southern Republican congressman who's got a conscience. He voted for the war. One of the most vocal supporters of the war called me at my home two Mondays ago, June 16th, and said, Mr. Bugliosi, I've listened to the audio tape of your book, and I can tell you that I'm convinced now that George Bush deliberately misled Congress into war. I've already given several copies of the book to colleagues in Congress, and I'm telling them, we've been lied to, read the book. And he said early on next month, he's going to be calling me. He wants a conference call between me and him and several other people to decide where to go from here. But this is a very, very conservative, Republican, Southern congressman. Well, it's humid tonight. Who is it? I'm not sure that he would want me to release his name right now. He would? No, I'm not sure. I think he's running for re-election, but I can tell you he's talking about it on the Hill. I just heard a couple days ago he's passing out additional books on the Hill. Whether he wants me to say it publicly, I don't know, but I will eventually ask him flat out, can I mention his name? In George Bush's first speech to the nation on Hussein in Iraq, October 7th, 2002, Cincinnati, Ohio, Bush told Americans that Saddam Hussein was a great danger to this nation, either by his attacking us with so-called weapons of mass destruction or by giving these weapons to a terrorist group to attack us. And Bush said that this attack could happen, quote, on any given day, unquote, meaning what? That the threat was imminent. The only big problem for George Bush is that on October the 1st, 6 days earlier, the CIA sent Bush its 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, a classified top-secret report that represented the opinion, the consensus opinion, of all 16 U.S. federal intelligence agencies on the issue of whether or not Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country. And on page 8 of that 91-page report, it clearly and unequivocally says, and by the way, what I'm about to tell you, to my knowledge, has never been said or never been written or never appeared in any major newspaper or magazine in America. Page 8 clearly says that Hussein was not an imminent threat to the security of this country, that he'd only be a threat if he feared that we were about to attack him. In other words, he'd only be a threat if he was forced to fight in self-defense. So we know then, not think, but know, that when George Bush told the nation on the evening of October the 7th, Cincinnati, Ohio, that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, he was telling millions of unsuspecting Americans the exact opposite of what his own CIA was telling him. Now, if we had nothing else at all, and there's so much more, that alone shows what? That George Bush took this nation to war on a terrible, terrible lie. And therefore, all the killings of American soldiers in Iraq became unlawful killings and therefore murder. But it gets worse. It gets worse. October 4th, 3 days later, Bush and his people had the CIA release an unclassified summary version of the October 1st classified report, so this October 4th unclassified version could be released to the American public and to Congress. This unclassified version came to be known as the White Paper. And in this White Paper that was shown to the American people and to Congress, and which contained the opinion of 16 U.S. intelligence agencies that Hussein was not an imminent threat to the security of this country, that conclusion was completely deleted, completely eliminated. Every single one of these all-important words, the most important conclusion in that classified document, was completely deleted from the White Paper. And the question I have of you is how evil, how perverse, how sick, how criminal can George Bush and his people be? And yet, unbelievably, and there's no other word for it, up to this point they've gotten away with all of that, with all of this. And 100,000 minimum precious human beings are in their cold graves right now as I am talking to you because of it. Many of you have heard of the Downing Street memo. You heard of that? Good. Received much attention in the media. It's been in many, many books. But really, the July 23rd, 2002 memo, actually the minutes of a meeting between British Prime Minister Tony Blair and his war cabinet, it's good, but not that strong. The reason I say that is because, number one, the source of what is in that memo is not given, and also the words that the Bush administration intended to, quote, fix the facts, unquote, around the Bush administration's intention to go to war. I, for one, don't know exactly for sure what the words fix the facts mean. Now, fix means create the facts. That's extremely bad, obviously. But if they mean arrange the facts, which goes in the direction of cherry picking, that's bad too, and I talk a lot about cherry picking in the book. I wouldn't take George Bush to trial on first-degree murder based on cherry picking, which is kind of common. Bad, but common, and I wouldn't take him to war or take him to trial on cherry picking. So the Downing Street memo, well, good, might offer it. It's a little ambiguous, not that strong. I'm sorry? Well, I think I said that it's July 23rd, 2002 minutes of a meeting between Prime Minister Tony Blair and his war cabinet. But there's another memo called the Manning Memo that received very, very, very little attention in the media, and hardly anyone I talk to knows anything about it. But it is much, much more powerful than the Downing Street Memo. On January 31st, 2003, less than 2 months before Bush and Blair invaded Iraq, Bush and Blair met for 2 hours in the Oval Office with 6 of their top aides, including Blair's chief foreign policy advisor, David Manning. And after the meeting, Manning prepared a 5-page memo stamped extremely sensitive in which he summarized what was said at the meeting. And he said that Bush and Blair expressed their doubts that any weapons of mass destruction would ever be found in Iraq. But here comes the terrible part. And he's talking about Bush, not Blair. He says that George Bush was so worried about the failure of the UN inspectors to find weapons of mass destruction that Bush started to talk about 3 ways to, quote, provoke a confrontation, unquote, with Saddam Hussein. One of which, he said, was to, quote, fly U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Iraq, falsely painted in United Nations colors. And he said if Saddam fires on those planes, that would be a violation of UN resolutions and therefore justify our going to war. So here's George Bush telling Americans, the American people, telling the world that Hussein is an imminent threat to the security of this country, but behind closed doors, this very small human being was talking about how to provoke Hussein into a war. Now, I can tell you that the very last person in the world that a person acting in self-defense would try to provoke is a person he's in deathly fear of, a person who's about to kill him. If George Bush honestly believed that Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, which he told everyone, that was his main basis for going to war, the thought of provoking Hussein into a war, by definition, would never, ever, ever have entered his mind. I was on Dennis Miller's radio show about a week and a half ago. Dennis fell hopelessly in love with the Republican Party at the time of 9/11, and I talk about Dennis's silliness in the book. Anyway, I said, Dennis, I'm going to appoint you. I don't know if I use the word appoint, but I'm saying you're George Bush's defense attorney. And I call David Manning to the stand, and he testifies to what your guy, George Bush, said at that meeting, January 31st, 2003. And I said, Dennis, other than trying to hide beneath the console table, what would your response be to David Manning's testimony and the Manning memo? Dennis is pretty bright, pretty sharp, and he said, I would ask for a recess. Well, no matter how long that recess lasted, whether it was an hour, a day, a week, a month, or a year, there's no answer to the Manning memo except guilt. And listen to this. Between November of 2002 and March of 2003, Hans Blix, you've heard of him, Chief Weapons Inspector for the United Nations, he and his inspectors, about 100 of them, conducted 731 inspections all over Iraq, found no weapons of mass destruction. But here's the most important point. March 7th, 2003, Blix testified before the United Nations Security Council. And he told the Security Council that he was getting, quote, proactive cooperation from Hussein. And he said, we are able to perform no-notice inspections all over Iraq. We are able to perform no-notice inspections. I should add another word. We are able to perform professional no-notice inspections all over Iraq. And he added, to confirm, absolutely confirm whether or not Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It would not take years, but months, and he requested that time. Now, to anyone who wanted to avoid the horror and the terrible tragedy and the suffering and the deaths in Iraq, Blix's report couldn't possibly be any better. They would be extremely encouraged by what Blix said and wouldn't have even dreamed of going to war in less than 2 weeks. But what did Bush do? He booted Blix and his people out of Iraq, went to war, and did not give Blix the requested time. Now, why? Well, I think it's kind of obvious to me. Maybe at a trial, the defense attorney could come up with a better interpretation. But here's my interpretation on that. In a very paradoxical type of way, Blix and his people became Bush's biggest adversaries. Because if Blix and his people confirmed that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that would rob Bush of his main argument for war, a war he wanted to fight at all costs. Now, if you know another reasonable interpretation for Bush's conduct, you can bring it up during the Q&A period, because I don't know what in the world it is. The prosecution of George W. Bush for murder has much, much more evidence, of course, of Bush's guilt in it, but obviously in the limited time we have, we can't go over the entire book. But there's another very important matter that I want to discuss with you. It would not be introducible during the guilt phase, but during the penalty phase, it would, where the issue is life or death. And obviously, what I'm going to be talking to you about, I think some of you know, has served as one of the strongest emotional underpinnings for this book. And that is the indisputable fact, there's no dispute, no way to dispute it. The evidence is overwhelming that throughout the hell on earth that George Bush created in Iraq, with over 100,000 people dying horrible, violent deaths, and hundreds of thousands of their survivors crying out hysterically and having nightmares over what happened to their loved ones, George Bush smiled through it all. In fact, you can look at a photograph of Bush and 6 or 7 other people. They're all smiling. Who's got the biggest smile on his face? George Bush. The evidence is very clear that while young American soldiers, 18, 19-year-old kids, who never had a chance to live out their dreams, were being blown to pieces by roadside bombs in Iraq, George Bush was having a lot of fun and enjoying life to the fullest. I'm talking about running, bicycling, joking with friends, slapping backs, dancing and swiveling his hips like Elvis to blaring music, eating his blueberry pie and hot dogs, almost always seeming to be in the very best of good spirits. Oh, I know that the White House press people say he takes the loss of American lives hard and he suffers, but that's just pure moonshine. That dog will not run. These are just cheap, worthless words. Suffering on one hand and having fun, joking around, and enjoying life on the other are simply incompatible. They cannot coexist. They are mutually exclusive. No one has to take my word for this, or the photos in the book which show Bush having a ball throughout the war. Bush himself has had no hesitancy at all in saying things like this over and over again. And while I'm quoting Bush, I'm going to give you a couple quotes of his. I want you to try to imagine in your wildest imagination Roosevelt, Truman, LBJ, Nixon, during their respective wars, saying things like this. And also, while I'm quoting George Bush's words, I want you to realize, as I'm sure you do, the horror, the sea of blood, the screams that were going on at the very same time that he's uttering these words. Here's Bush. Laura and I are having the time of our lives. It's going to be a perfect day. I'm in a great mood. I'm feeling pretty good about life. With respect to George Bush's remark at a December 2007 White House press conference that he was feeling pretty good about life, here's someone whose war has cost this nation over $1 trillion so far with no end in sight, literally destroyed or virtually destroyed the entire nation of Iraq, and most importantly by far, and it bears repeating, he's directly responsible for over 100,000 precious human beings dying horrible, violent deaths, yet he says he's feeling pretty good about his life? It's too unbelievable for words. In March of 2005, right in the midst of the Iraq War, Mark McKinnon, a biking friend of Bush, known him for years. In fact, he was Bush's chief media strategist during Bush's 2004 re-election campaign. Here's what Mark McKinnon told the New York Times about Bush, right in the middle of the war. Quote, "He's as calm and relaxed and happy as I've ever seen him." In March of this year, Bush shows up at a press conference to endorse John McCain. McCain's a little late. What does Bush do? Spontaneously, with a big smile on his face, he starts doing a soft shoe tap dance routine to entertain the assembled media. I tell you, this is a happy man. Even if Bush was only guilty of making an innocent mistake, let me say that again. Even if George Bush was only guilty of making an innocent mistake and taking this nation to war in Iraq, not murder, as I firmly believe, with all of the death, horror, and suffering he has caused, what type of a monstrous individual is it who could be happy with his life? What type of a human monster is George Bush? The perfect day comment was the, the straw that broke the camel's back for me. The date, I think, was August 13th, 2005, during Bush's 5-week summer vacation, right in the midst of some of the very worst fighting and atrocities in Iraq. Terrible mutilations of bodies, beheadings, terrible. And with American and Iraqi survivors screaming out, crying out uncontrollably over the deaths of their children, parents, brothers, sisters, and in many instances only receiving back the dismembered parts and limbs of their loved ones, and finding no way at all, obviously, to cope with the unspeakable horror of it all. George Bush, at his ranch, after a hearty breakfast, told reporters what his plans were for the rest of the day. Here's George Bush, right in the midst of all that horror and death. I'm going to have lunch with Secretary of State Rice. She had been elevated, I guess, from National Security Advisor. Talk a little business. Take a little nap. I'm reading an Elmore Leonard book right now. Knock off a little Elmore Leonard this afternoon. Go fishing with my man Barney, that's his dog. Have a light dinner, then head for the ball game. So it's a perfect day. So it's a perfect day, he said. And I remember when I read those words, I said to myself, no, you son of a bitch, if I may call you that, Mr. President. You're not... You're not going to have a perfect day. Or I should say, you're not going to have another perfect day for as long as you live if I have anything to say about it. Because I'm going to put a thought in your mind that you're going to take with you to your grave. That's the least that I can do for the thousands of American soldiers who came back from your war in a box or a jar of ashes, and the thousands upon thousands of innocent Iraqi men, women, children, and babies who died horrible, violent deaths because of your war. That's the least that I can do. When I was talking about putting that thought in his mind for the rest of his life, I'm talking about the prosecution of George Bush for murder and the fact that there's no statute of limitations for the crime of murder. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, I don't know about you, but if I ever killed one person in my life, even accidentally, a car accident, I'd never have another perfect day for as long as I lived. And here, Bush is responsible for the deaths, the horrible deaths of thousands of human beings, and he's talking about having a perfect day. Bush's plans to have a perfect day, right in the middle of all the death and horror in Iraq, go so far beyond acceptable human conduct that no moral telescope can discern its shape, form, and nature. What George Bush and his co-conspirators like Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice have done and taken this nation to war in Iraq on a lie is so monumentally base, so extraordinarily wrong and dishonorable and criminal that I'm not gifted enough as a writer to describe it. In view of the ghastly and calculable consequences of their act and the greatness of their sin, it would take a Tolstoy, a Shakespeare, a Hemingway to give people an illuminating glimpse into the darkness of their souls. But I suspect that a great writer would be trying to give verbal flesh to the fact that Bush and his people had absolutely no regard for the millions of Americans whom they deliberately deceived into war, that Bush had no appreciation for, nor sense of responsibility to, the exalted and towering office that he occupied. No concern at all about a betrayal of trust, perhaps unprecedented, I will say unprecedented in the recorded annals of American history. People are telling me that they didn't think it was possible to have more contempt for George Bush than they already did, but to their surprise upon reading the book, their contempt rises dramatically. So I've even had people with high blood pressure say they can't read more than 5 or 6 pages of the book without putting it down because they get so angry. I don't like to see anyone get away with murder, even one murder. Simpson got away with 2 murders, and I got so angry I wrote a book, Outrage, The 5 Reasons Why O.J. Simpson Got Away with Murder. If I can get so angry about someone getting away with 1 or 2 murders, you can imagine how I feel about George Bush, who has gotten away with over 100,000 murders and has been smiling and enjoying himself throughout the whole period. It may sound presumptuous of me, I'm just about to wrap it up, but I can tell you that although I may not succeed, I'm not going to be satisfied until I see George Bush in an American courtroom being prosecuted for first-degree murder. I want an American jury to decide whether he's guilty or not guilty of murder, and if they conclude he is and convict him of first-degree murder, it'll be up to them then to decide what the appropriate punishment should be. One of their options being the imposition of the death penalty. Another option being life imprisonment, and life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Although I don't have myself any clout, I got the clout of an emaciated moth, I'm no longer associated with law enforcement. Within days, I'm going to be reaching out to prosecutors throughout this land, looking for a courageous prosecutor who does have the clout, who does have the authority to prosecute George Bush for murder. And I'll be starting out by sending a copy of my book with a cover letter from me to each of the 50 attorney generals throughout this country. I'll be asking them to read the book, and if they agree with me that the evidence of Bush's guilt is clear and that there's jurisdiction to proceed against him criminally, I'm also offering my services in whatever way the prosecutor sees fit. It could be all the way from an accountant up to and including being appointed a special prosecutor. If justice means anything at all in America, and if we're not going to forget about these 4,000 young American soldiers who came back from Bush's war in a box, I say we have no choice but to bring murder charges against the son of privilege from Crawford, Texas. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, let's open this up to questions and answers now. You can ask me any question that you want. I can tell you what some of the questions that are being asked of me on radio throughout the country, in addition to what we've already talked about here. These are some of the questions. The matter of jurisdiction to prosecute Bush on a state, local, and federal level. The matter of Bush's successful effort to convince the American people that Hussein was involved in 9/11. The matter of impeachment and why I'm not bothering with it, although he certainly should be impeached, obviously. And can Bush be prosecuted as a war criminal in the International Court at The Hague? Also, although this is a question that you would not ask me because you're not aware of it, many of you are not, the considerable difficulty I had in getting this book published and the fact that I've been totally blacked out by the mainstream media, I would like to talk about that if any of you are interested. So let's open this up to questions and answers now. Yes, sir. Yeah,
thank you. Mr. Bugliosi, thank you very much for being here and for all of your hard work on behalf of the American citizenry, both in the past and currently. Thank you. Before I ask my question, I'd like to answer one that you would ask if anybody had an answer for what kind of monster is George Bush. I would offer the answer that he's really nothing more than a garden variety elitist being propped up by some rather extraordinary elitists. And I really wish you well, and I will back you in every way that I can in your pursuit of this man for murder. But I'd like to know your opinion on the larger issue of Bush not being the brightest guy. It appears that a lot of our questions, a lot of the questions you raised earlier, would be answered in the larger context of Bush operating as something of a front man, as has been spelled out in the Project for a New American Century agenda, the plans of the Council on Foreign Relations, and how comfortable are you looking into the broader perspective of Bush being a threat and being guilty and being held accountable is a good thing, but at what point do we need to look at the threat that he represents? What's behind it?
You're going into the third, fourth, and fifth, and sixth questions. And I appreciate what you're saying, but you're asking a lot of questions. Are you going in the direction of saying that George Bush is not guilty by reason of insanity? Are you going in that direction?
No, I am not. I wish I could. That would make things a lot simpler.
Because he's not going to get up there and say, yes, I deliberately took this nation to war in a lie, but give me a break because I'm insane. He's not going to do that.
At what point do you begin to look behind him and the agendas of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Project for a New American Century?
Well, I'm going to look. A grand jury would have to be convened, obviously, and obviously George Bush conspired with others. The two obvious ones are Cheney and Rice. The grand jury testimony may reveal that other people are involved, like Rove, Rumsfeld. I seem to have a sense about Powell that his only sin was weakness. But that would all come out at the grand jury and the taking of testimony and the interviewing of witnesses. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions.
No, you say two. There's other people. If you could just ask one, because if you ask me a quick question, I might talk for a half hour. So if
you said if
just ask one question.
If he ever gets prosecuted,
yes.
Is there anything we in this room can do to help make sure that the if happens?
Okay.
And have you spoken to Attorney Brown? If our Attorney General Brown?
You asked me a bad question. Okay. Okay. What can you folks do? Well, I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. In about a week and a half or two from now, it looks like the parents of a young man who was killed in Iraq are going in with a copy of this book to see the district attorney of a major American city back east and asking him if he accepts what I say in this book to prosecute George Bush for first-degree murder. So what can you do? You can organize people to see the local DA, state attorney general, write letters. I'm already going to send out, as I say, 50 books. There's many other DAs in the country, but I'm starting out with the state attorney general. But about the only thing you can do is you cannot go to anyone else. You can't even go to Congress. Congress cannot prosecute him. It's just the district attorney, the state attorney general, or the attorney general of the United States back in Washington, D.C. There is no one else that can prosecute him. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Yes, if we can bring George Bush to trial in an American courtroom, how can we protect our legal process from the manipulations that we saw in the O.J. Simpson trial, given the fact that Bush has access to more money than God?
A lot of it has to do with the competence of the prosecutor, okay? You can draw whatever inference you want from that, okay? I hate to say things because it sounds boasting, but let me tell you, he would not have walked out of that court if I was a prosecutor. Has a lot to do with the prosecutor. Okay, yeah.
My question goes to Congress's current plan to grant immunity and actually legalize criminality retroactively.
No, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Congress's current plan?
Well, what they're currently doing now with the FISA law and basically giving retroactive immunity to criminality with the telecoms, and whether this kind of actions by the Congress could end up being applied to Bush, because most people are thinking that the reason they're doing it is to cover up their own culpability, like Jane Harman and Pelosi and
Ma'am,
like that.
I'm a very focused person, and right now I'm going after George Bush. And you're talking about something that I've heard a little bit of, but I'm not equipped to answer that question. But I have never heard that Congress is telling people that have committed crimes, your crimes are exonerated. I haven't heard that. Is that what you're saying?
That's what's happening right now.
So they're signing legislation that previous crimes committed by other members of Congress are completely forgiven. Is that what you're saying?
No, telecom is a telecom immunity.
But to make it short, Congress is not going to say that if George Bush took this nation to war under false pretenses, we're going to forgive him. I mean, that's almost inconceivable. However, George Bush could pardon could pardon Cheney, Rice, Rove. He could do that. And the next president, whether it's Obama or McCain, could pardon Bush. I don't think that's going to happen. You know what happened to Ford when he pardoned Nixon?
Yeah.
The general belief of historians is that he lost when he ran for re-election, and we were talking about crimes infinitely less serious than taking the nation to war under false pretense. I think you're talking about a very theoretical thing. You really don't think you're going to pick up the paper in the morning and Congress has passed a law saying that if George Bush committed any crimes, he's exonerated. You're not going to read it. You don't believe that. Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
Yes.
First,
No, you say first, if you could keep it away, because there's other people that have questions.
first, I just want to thank you for bringing a whole new level of hope to the whole debate about justice. That thanks to you, there's a new type of hope, a new level of hope. A lot of people have just felt hopeless, and I'm so proud that someone has stood up and said that they're going to do something. And my question is, how soon after George is out of office is it possible for the prosecution to go forward? And this man already asked my other question, what can I do to help?
Okay, well, the investigative process could start right now, but he cannot be prosecuted until he leaves office, which would be, what, January 20th, 2009. But the U.S. Constitution makes it very clear, once he leaves office, he can be prosecuted for any crime he committed while he was in office. So the actual prosecution could not commence until January 21st, 2009. But the investigative process, going to the grand jury and all, that could start right now.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I too feel so much hope with what you're doing, and also the fact of your colleague William Pepper helping to launch a new ballot initiative in New York City to have a first real investigation of September 11th.
Good.
And this is a huge, because this adds on another 6,000 victims if you count the people that are dying since that day in New York City. And I just wonder if you're keeping abreast of all this evidence that's been exposed by engineers and pilots and physicists.
No, I'm really not. I am so busy that I can't even read the daily paper. I have to postpone dental and medical appointments. My wife says I work morning to morning. I get to bed around 2, and I get up around 10. So I know what you're saying, but I'm really focused. My book on the Kennedy assassination was the equivalent of 13 volumes of 400-page books, over 10,000 citations. So I was just working on that.
I want you to know that
I appreciate what you're saying, and at due time I will get to it. But the papers are stacked up to the ceiling with magazines, so I'm not keeping up on anything other than putting this guy behind bars and hopefully death row. Hopefully death row.
Vince, you and I spoke this afternoon. My name is Stephen Rohde.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I pledge to stand with you in any prosecution that anybody launches anywhere in this country.
I'm honored by that, sir. Thank you very much.
What I want to ask, to be tough on ourselves, is to look at the other side of the argument.
Yes.
The government across this country has been invoking the state secrets privilege in various cases, including torture and rendition. Whenever a case touches on national security, the courts have upheld the state secrets doctrine when anyone needs to defend themselves or prosecute a claim. If it touches on national security, courts have said such a case cannot go forward. Have you considered, and are you concerned, that Bush and/or the government would intervene in such a murder prosecution and invoke the state secrets doctrine?
Steve, did you ask me that question over the phone today?
That was a different question.
No, it's the same one. And what did I tell you?
You didn't know.
Okay, but you're asking me anyway.
No, I asked you about the Vietnam.
Okay. I'll answer you. No,
I asked you about the Vietnam War.
But you talked about the courts suppressing records.
Yeah, all right. Anyway, I'm asking you this now.
It's virtually the same.
And as a prosecutor would say, answer the question, Mr. Bugliosi.
Yes, sir. All right, all right. But I answer the question for you today. I don't believe that any American court in a criminal case, you were talking about civil cases, I'm talking about a criminal case, when you issue a subpoena for a document, no criminal judge is going to say, you don't have a right to provide us with this document. That's not going to happen. Nixon, talking about impeachment, not murder, but impeachment, as you know, went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. What did the court say, Steve? What did the court tell Nixon?
Had to produce the document.
Okay, right. I think that's the answer to your question. I haven't studied all the implications, but Steve, I talked to you today about that question.
We'll work on this
and
together.
you come up with the same identical
Different question,
okay.
but I promise to work with you.
All right, but there are other people that want to talk about things. A criminal judge is not going to permit George Bush, if he's on trial for murder, saying, I refuse to turn over these documents. That's not going to happen, Stephen, okay? Number two, most of these documents that I've been talking about today have already been declassified. Okay, yes, sir.
I was next over here, sir.
Yes, sir.
Quick question about motive. I'm curious, in every law situation that I've heard of, there always needs to be some form of motive involved, especially in a murder case. Can you talk to what your thoughts are on why these guys chose to go to war and fool everybody in the process?
I have a whole chapter on that. And the question is, what was Bush's motive? I do not know the answer to your question. I can tell you what motive he gave. He told the world Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and therefore he was an imminent threat to the security of this country. Now, not all people believe that. They talk about motives ranging from oil and politics and maybe a family drama, a Bush family drama where he's trying to outdo his father. But I can tell you this. Motive is not an element of the corpus delicti of any crime. So any prosecution of George Bush, the prosecutor would not have the burden of proving motive. I've put people on death row without knowing for sure why they committed the crime. All I knew is they put someone in their grave 6 feet under, and they had no legal justification for doing it. So that's not an element of the corpus, but it's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, based on what you said, I think you have a winning case. I'm just an amateur, but it sounds convincing. And therefore, I think when he's facing the guilty verdict, I think he's going to want to bring up, whether as unpalatable as it might be, the insanity defense. And I think being a sociopath, a person without a conscience, is already such a thing. You've said he won't do it, but you've already showed, since he has a great day all the time, that you've already convinced us that he is a sociopath. So why wouldn't he use that if it's the only way he can escape the death penalty?
Well, like I told you, the insanity defense in the criminal law is normally used in a situation where the jury wants to find some way to give this guy a break. But when you commit a mass murder, you don't say, yes, I did it, but give me a break because I'm crazy. You don't do that. So Bush is not going to say, yes, I'm guilty of 100,000 murders, but I'm legally insane. First base, I don't think he's legally insane. I think he's a morally defective human being. I think he's a bad human being. I don't think he's insane. I think he knows. Just like Manson, people say it's Manson. No, he's able to assess his weaknesses and strengths. He knows what he's doing. Manson, his biggest hero, he was crazy the way Hitler was crazy. He looked up to Hitler. He said Hitler was a tuned-in guy who would level the karma of the Jews, okay? I don't believe that George Bush is insane. But do you really think he's going to go to trial? You were talking about an insanity defense after he's convicted. No, it's got to be at the beginning, not later. Do you think he's going to go to trial in front of an American jury in Des Moines, Iowa, and say, I'm guilty of everything that Mr. Bugliosi or whatever the prosecutor says. I'm guilty of everything. I took this nation to war on a lie. I'm a terrible human being, but I'm insane. Give me a break. Do you think he's going to do that?
Yes, if you read your book,
no, I'm asking you. I'm asking you. I'm serious.
If you read your book, he'll do it.
He will do that?
Yeah.
So he's gonna confess to 100,000 murders.
If your book is and your case is as good as you think it is, yes, he'll be forced to.
Well, you see, when you plead insanity, by definition, you are confessing to the crime.
Yes, that's
and you
right.
think he's going to confess to the crime?
If there's no other way out, yes.
I think in his mind, the only possible way out is self-defense, and he's not going to get anywhere with it. I even have proposed cross-examination questions of him in here.
I think it comes down to what the psychiatrists define as insanity. If a sociopath or a sociopath is insane,
sociopaths are not insane. They're bad human beings, but they're not insane.
Okay.
Yes.
In regards to the Manning memo, if that was an extremely sensitive document, how then did certain media have access to it and, of course, never covered it?
The New York Times had total access to it. It first came out in a book in England by a professor by the name of Philip Sands, who saw the entire document. Channel 4 in England saw it, but the New York Times saw the entire document, and it was in the New York Times. But that is a memo that got little attention. The Downing memo, to me, is a little ambiguous, got a tremendous amount of attention.
All right, keep up the good work. Thank you.
I appreciate it, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you give us some specific comments that publishers said why they were afraid to publish your book? Like, are we going to be, I might be investigated by the IRS, I might be investigated by the Justice Department, the FBI might come after me.
I had one law professor say, I don't want to be investigated by the IRS. No, I had a very difficult time getting this book published. I've never had that problem in my whole career, because I've had, 3 books got up to #1 New York Times, and I've had a lot of bestsellers. There was never an issue about getting the book published. This time it was so tough, I had to fly to New York City, met with several publishers. They'd say things like this to me: are you sure, Mr. Bugliosi, that you want to publish this book? The fear was palpable. One put it in black and white, too hot to handle. Eventually, we got a courageous prosecutor, a courageous publisher at Vanguard Press, Roger Cooper, and he published the book. Now we go to the next level, the audio for the book. In the past, I never even concerned myself with the audio. I'd get a phone call from the agent, like in Reclaiming History, Simon & Schuster did it. This time, he calls me on the phone. He says, Vince, I can't find any audio company in America that will do the audio on this book. So we got the British Broadcasting Company, and they did it. Right now, as I'm talking to you, there's a documentary for the big screen based on this book. The producers could not raise 1 penny in America. The money had to come in from Canada. Now, when the book came out, with all my other books, I don't ask whether I'm going to be on national TV. I don't ask that. My question is, when am I flying back to New York City? I know about the publication date of the book, and I say it's a Tuesday or Wednesday. You don't ask, are you going to be on national TV? It's an automatic. This book here, I didn't fly back to New York City. I've been totally and completely blacked out by the national media. Liberal, moderate, conservative, a complete total blackout. And I just heard today or yesterday, I forget, because one day runs into the next, that a major newspaper is thinking about running a feature article on the fact that, based on who I am and my background, that this book should not be totally blacked out by the American media, and it is. So there may be a major article in a major American paper. And, let me tell you something. I don't mind, if we can break up the liberal media into two areas. Most of them, maybe I'm hurting people, but I'm just being candid. I'm as blunt as I'm as subtle as a blunt axe. 80 to 85% of them, as I say in the book, they are physiological marvels in that they're able to sit erect in front of a camera without having a spine. They are absolutely terrified of their own shadow, and the only thing they stand for is to stand for nothing, okay? I'm not angry at those people. Why? If they're frightened and terrified, who am I to tell them that they're bad people? If they're frightened, they're frightened. That doesn't mean I respect them, but I'm not angry with them. But I'll tell you who I am angry with, okay? There's a group out there that's not frightened of the right wing. They're liberal. They're not frightened of the right wing. They're not frightened of the Bush administration. They get on TV and call Bush a criminal and a murderer. And those people are refusing to answer emails, I guess they call them that, or anything. No response from any of these people. In the second edition of this book, I'm going to be talking about those people. I'm angry with those people, okay? Because those people are not afraid to speak out. Most of the liberal media is just terrified, absolutely terrified of their shadow.
That's what I mean. What are they terrified of?
What are they terrified of? It's just a guess on my part. I believe that it all goes back to the right wing in this country. They have transformed this nation into a nation when people, for the first time ever, don't feel completely comfortable living in America. When you have someone that's as decent and honorable as Rush Limbaugh saying that, I don't mean Rush Limbaugh, I'm sorry, Mario Cuomo saying that he respects Rush Limbaugh. When you have Mario Cuomo saying that he respects Rush Limbaugh, that's intimidation, okay? If I may be so presumptuous, Mario Cuomo does not respect Rush Limbaugh. How would that be humanly possible? But that is just one example among many of the shadow of fear that has descended upon this once great nation. I trace it back to the right wing in this country. These are bad human beings. But I don't know the answer. You asked me a question. I'm just telling you I think it's the right wing. See, the left wing is terrified of the right wing. The right wing is not terrified of the left wing. So the liberals are not going to have me on because they don't want to be savaged by the right wing, and the right wing doesn't want to have me talking with them on national television about prosecuting their guy for first-degree murder and seeking the death penalty. They don't want that. So I've been totally blacked out for the first time in my publishing career. However, the book, miraculously, I just got a call, it's number 12 now on the New York Times bestseller list. But that's because of people like you folks and Eileen Proctor getting me radio interviews that I didn't even know about. She's on the phone spending her own money. It's people like you people that are getting the message of this book out and word of mouth. And the publisher back east, you know, 12 is not a good number for me, okay? But the publishers say, Vince, you've got to be crazy. You've been totally blacked out by the national media and you're already on the New York Times bestseller list. So I guess I should look at it that way. But I'm telling you, the blackout has been complete. Never happened to me before in my entire
So are we just left to read between the lines then? Like one publisher might say, my stocks will go to hell, no one will buy my stocks. Another one might say, I'm afraid of the right wing.
I don't know what it is, but you know, they were aware of the marketability of this book. And I think we have a situation here where fear trumped money. There's a lot of fear in this country. Whoever thought before that it was not safe to live in America? How can you feel safe in America when you have people like Ken Starr, when you have the theft of the 2000 election, and when you have Bush going to war against the nation, not our enemy, not involved in 9/11, and as much of a threat to the security of this country as you, I, or an aunt of mine who lives up in Minnesota? Now, don't you have to get a little alarmed and frightened to live in a country like that?
Let me start with the last point you made before I get into mine, and that is...
Well, you're asking two questions, and again, there's other people.
No, I'm not asking two questions.
I don't care if someone asks 10
questions. I'm not
questions.
asking two questions.
Okay.
What I'm suggesting is that everybody, I'm halfway through this book, everybody needs to buy a copy of it. And with respect to the media, it's not a liberal media, there's a corporate media, right. And then there is media such as you were on Democracy Now!, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for having you on.
Yeah.
So, my question is this. I read in here, and I was somewhat surprised that you laid into Michael Moore for implying that one of the motives behind the lies that you so well document in this book is that Bush wanted to enrich his cronies. And I would suggest that if you haven't read that, you ought to get a hold of some of the work of Naomi Klein, because she makes a compelling case that Reconstruction has become a standing industry and that Iraq was a form of preemptive deconstruction. And my question on a legal sense to you is this.
Well, what you say may be true, because I don't know. But I find it a little hard to believe that the reason he went to war is to destroy Iraq and everything so his rich friends could build it up and make money. That's a possibility, but I don't think so.
If you read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, I don't think you'll think it's far-fetched, but let me get to the point that I am making, which is if you could make the case that the imperial conquest and ongoing occupation of Iraq is really a form of an ongoing armed robbery, would the felony murder rule apply?
Oh, theoretically, in a law school sense, yes. In the real world, no. No, it's just so extremely far out that a judge would look at me and say, Mr. Villosa, I think you have lost your marbles. But I mean, in a law school, are you a lawyer?
Yes, I am.
Okay. In a law school sense, I guess you could say yes.
Well, my other question had to do with jurisdiction, and that is there, with respect, because I don't practice criminal law, never did.
Right.
Is there any issue of federal preemption with respect to the War Crimes Act superseding local jurisdictions?
Okay, the War Crimes Act, are you talking about at The Hague, you mean?
No, I'm talking about the federal War Crimes Act. You can be prosecuted in federal court
for lying to Congress and stuff like that.
For committing war crimes. In fact, what happened following the Hamdan decision, when Justice Kennedy sent a shot across the bow of the USS Unitary Executive by saying that violations of the Geneva Conventions are violations of federal statutes, and if a prisoner dies, someone could be prosecuted if they're responsible, any U.S. citizen, for even for the death penalty. And Gonzales, when he got the Military Commissions Act of 2006, it included a provision that specifically claims to have granted an immunity retroactive to 9/11/01 for all crimes committed in service of the War on Terror.
Well, the War Crimes Act that you're talking about, I never remember seeing anything in there. I have something about it in here, in the book, but nothing about murder. It's about lying to Congress. Now, if you're talking about war crimes, then you're talking about the International Criminal Court at The Hague. They would not have jurisdiction here because the United States was not a signatory nation to the agreement in Rome in 2002. So not being a signatory nation, the ICC would not have jurisdiction. But you're talking about lying to Congress here.
Well, actually, I'm talking
It's under
about,
maybe war crimes, but there's nothing in there about murder.
I'm talking about what Justice Jackson said was the ultimate war crime, which is to initiate a war of aggression, which he said from which all other war crimes follow, and the Nazi foreign minister was hanged for the invasion of Norway at the beginning of World War II.
Yeah.
And I don't see any difference between that and what Bush did in Iraq.
Except you have to look at the words of the statute. And when they're talking about war crimes, they're talking about torture and lying to Congress. I'll read it right here. Although the possibility of a prosecution of Bush for torture will not be examined in this book, if it could be shown that Bush authorized the torture of Iraq and Afghanistan war detainees and prisoners that we know took place at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo respectively, under 18 U.S.C. sections 2340 to 2334A, the War Crimes Act of 1996, he could be prosecuted for the torture. And if convicted, he could be imprisoned for not more than 20 years. I have to say this, though, that his complicity in the tortures at Guantanamo, et cetera, is not that clear. We don't know that yet. In fact, he did issue a presidential directive in February of 2002 mandating that all detainees be treated humanely. That doesn't mean that he wasn't involved. I'm just telling you there is a presidential directive mandating the opposite. But the War Crimes Act doesn't talk about murder, it talks about torture.
Okay, thank
but
you.
there is a war crimes tribunal at The Hague, which would not have jurisdiction over George Bush, because the United States is not a signatory nation.
Thank you.
Very good questions, by the way. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got a question about the consequences of possible prosecution, and it has to do with the intermediaries between Bush and the murder. Now, if you can prosecute Bush, why can't you prosecute each of the intermediaries who carried out his orders? Wouldn't they be accessories? I mean, not just Cheney, but also the sergeants and the...
No. Where would the criminal intent be? You got to be criminal intent. Just following orders, you feel that they're valid orders, but if they're a part of the conspiracy and you know it's all a lie, then you're talking about criminal intent.
So it has to be the conspirator.
But just carrying out an order, no, God, we'd be prosecuting 250,000 American soldiers.
Well, that was the point. I mean, if you had to face that
They've
consequence.
suffered enough already without prosecuting them for crimes.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Got to have criminal intent.
Yes, sir. As you pointed out earlier, the accessories to a crime, particularly of murder, are equally culpable.
Right.
Leaving aside the legal question for the moment, does that not mean that the Congress that last week voted another $192 billion to continue this military adventure in Iraq are also culpable of this crime, and that we as the public should hold them accountable, at least at the polls?
Well, they may be weak and incompetent, but are you suggesting that they're keeping this war in Iraq going under false pretenses?
Yes.
Maybe they are. If they are, then the answer would be yes, if they are. But do you have evidence of that?
Lots of it.
Can you name one piece? I'm not saying you're wrong. Can you name one piece of evidence that Congress is deliberately lying to this country, keeping us at war in Iraq under false pretenses? Can you give me one piece of evidence? I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Do you have one piece of evidence?
There is a long series of evidence that appears in the newspapers and has for several years now. I am hard-pressed to pull out a single example, but there are many.
I think we're staying there, and I don't know, I'm not studying that. I'm on to Bush right now, but I think they're staying there for political reasons, okay? Well, the Republicans want to stay there because anything George Bush wants to do, he's Republican, they are, it's just fine with them.
The Democrats are in charge of the Congress, and they voted $192 billion a week ago.
We have Nancy Pelosi not wanting to impeach George Bush. They're weak. They're spineless.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am?
I'm concerned about not too many people knowing about your book. Is it available in bookstores?
It's been sold out in many bookstores across the country, and I got to talk to the publisher tomorrow as to why that is, because before it's sold out, the sales staff should say, you know, you're getting close to being sold out. Do you want to order more copies? But people are coming up to me all the time and say, Vince, I went into this store and that store. It's not there anymore. But it's available on Amazon.com, of course. You know.
Where do you suggest the people who want to get it go?
I guess the cheapest place is Amazon.com. I guess it costs $17, but it's out there. But 99 out of 100 people probably don't know about the existence of this book. And believe me, I'm not suggesting that there's any conspiracy against me here. That's not it. It's just that each individual member of the establishment feels the same way. They don't want to talk to me about prosecuting George W. Bush for murder. But Clinton, who does absolutely nothing wrong at all except having consensual sex outside of marriage, wants to cover it up day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year they savaged him. But this guy is guilty of over 100,000 murders, and everyone wants to protect him, except me and you folks.
No Barnes & Noble?
Yeah, I'm sure it's at some Barnes & Noble, but it's been sold out for quite a while. Pardon?
A lot of people won't buy
Costco. Isn't that a food place or something? It may be there. I don't know. Yeah. But let me tell you, the word is getting out there. How do you end up number 12 when you're totally blacked out? It's got to be word of mouth. The word of mouth has been very powerful on this book. Yeah. It's been very, very powerful. Some people feel it's the best true crime book I ever wrote.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi. I have no question. I have a comment, a statement, actually. And first, I'd like to say thank you for creating this book.
I appreciate
and
it.
This is democracy at work. This is what democracy is
Yes.
right here.
Yep.
With that said, I served a year over in the Persian Gulf for this country under false pretenses. I joined out of high school. It was not televised, so the VA administration told me when I came back after 4 years, I could not get extra medical benefits and extra educational benefits because it wasn't televised to the nation or the world. So sad, so sorry, right? Further, you're very correct. It's a disgusting thing happening over there. It is murder. I was privy to and I was party to and a witness to on more than one occasion killing our own troops deliberately, staging propaganda to CNN. Okay, this is the truth. And this is going to haunt me forever. It's true. You're right. I don't see how Bush can make those statements. You know, I didn't join with that express intent. Those were orders handed down, but I did refuse at a certain point to continue to load.
Good for you. Good for you.
But under the UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice, it does expressly state in there, and I can't remember the code for the life of me now, but that they can execute you for insubordination during a time of war. And so, again, I was privy to one of the reasons. It's a multifaceted agenda, what this country has going on over there in that region of the world, and any time they're pursuing war. But one reason is oil. I was privy to that. Most people wouldn't know what goes on, and I can't really get into it. I got to let everybody else have the floor. But I wanted people here to know that it is horrible, and I don't want to be thanked for my service. I think it's abominable that I ever participated. I'm sorry I joined, except for the fact that I could come back and speak about it to the American people, and I'm not shutting up. I'm just not going to.
I appreciate it. Appreciate it.
And people might. One more thing I'd like to end with. I'm very scared at this point in my life because if the American population, by and large, knew where we're actually going, where this government is taking us on a global scale and national scale, you would be terrified. You'd be very terrified. And all I can say is you can YouTube and Google FEMA camps, chemtrails, and just things about your government. You're going to get answers. And read his book, please. Thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Appreciate it.
I wonder often whether our recurring role as a country in selecting leaders that do atrocities or commit blunders on behalf, carry water, so to speak, for other interests, whether there's anything that after the revolution we could put into the next Constitution that would prevent us having to go through this so often.
I think that's beyond my ken. I don't want to engage in uttering platitudinous statements. You asked a good question. I'm not capable of answering that question. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Success in this prosecution would be very satisfying retributive justice.
Yes.
But I'm afraid that it would do nothing to repair the Constitution. The violations of the Constitution that this man is guilty of can only be repaired by impeachment.
So are you suggesting maybe that we shouldn't bring this monstrous individual to justice? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm fine with that.
Okay, but you don't feel it will achieve that much. It might deter another monstrous individual like Bush, maybe 100 years from now, from doing the same thing, if he knows what happened to George Bush.
He should both be impeached and indicted.
About the impeachment thing, because you brought up impeachment, certainly I'm in favor of what Dennis Kucinich is doing. There's no question about that. Well, obviously. Well, why are you clapping about that? Obviously, but I do want to say this about impeachment. In America, apparently we impeach presidents for having consensual sex outside of marriage and trying to cover it up. Now, if we impeach presidents for that, then if there's a president that takes this nation to war under false pretenses and over 100,000 people are in their graves, obviously, the punishment has got to be much, much, much more severe. If he were impeached and convicted in the Senate, okay, and removed from office, he'd still be a free man. Still be able to wake up in the morning with his cup of coffee, his freshly squeezed orange juice, read the morning headlines. I guess he doesn't read the paper. Still be able to travel widely, lead a life of privilege, belong to his country club, get standing ovations whenever he speaks to the party faithful. Do you really believe that George Bush should be permitted to lead that type of life based on what he did? My point on impeachment is that for anyone interested in true justice, impeachment alone is a joke in this case. But we certainly should have impeachment. But that alone, no, that's not enough. Absolutely not. No. This guy should not be able to go back to his ranch in Crawford with a big smile on his face.
No, just catch him before he goes to Patagonia. Catch him before he goes to Patagonia, where he's there's no extradition.
I heard he bought some property in Paraguay. I hear things by osmosis because I don't have time to read the papers. Has he bought property in Paraguay? Because the Nazis, you know, that fled Hitler's Germany, there was I think General Stroessner or whatever in Paraguay, and he was accepting the Nazis down there for years after 1945. Yes, ma'am?
I'm envisioning the media frenzy with once Bush must go to the court, and I'm trying to picture CNN and Fox News and the media just absolutely going wild over this. My question is, what do you think will be their defense of George Bush, and what do you anticipate they will say in his defense? As well as what about the families of the 4,000 victims of the war, as well as the soldiers who have been wounded? Do you anticipate them putting out lawsuits against George Bush?
Well, you're asking several questions. Yes, they could bring a civil lawsuit. They cannot bring a criminal lawsuit. Absolutely not. No. They can only bring a civil lawsuit. Only the DA, Attorney General, or State Attorney General can bring a criminal lawsuit, but the survivors could bring a civil lawsuit, yes. Now, you said, what does his defense be? His main defense, I think, would be, he tried to argue self-defense, that he took this nation to war under the threat that Hussein was going to invade us, so we had to strike first. There are other arguments he would use, which I discussed in the endnotes. One is the war powers argument. It's really not in the Constitution, but it's a combination of many other constitutional provisions like commander-in-chief, et cetera. I've investigated, researched that entire area. The war powers thing does not give any president the right to go to war under false pretenses. Even much less than that, the courts have said, no, you got war powers to a certain degree, but infinitely less things than that. Truman, I think, what was it, 1952, Youngstown Steel versus, what do you call it? He wanted to take over, under the War Powers Act, he wanted to take over the steel mills because the war in Korea was going on and they were going to strike. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you got certain war powers, but you can't do that. So you certainly, a fortiori is a legal term, all the more so you can't take the nation to war under false pretenses. So I think his only defense would be self-defense. But like I told you, if you're acting in self-defense, do you talk about how to come up with bogus ideas to provoke someone into war? There's much other evidence in the book shows that this man deliberately took this nation to war on false pretenses.
I believe it. It's just that
curveball and the Niger incident, all types of things like that are in the book. But if I go over the whole book with you, you know, we'd be here at 2 in the morning.
He's just been so successful at slithering out of it.
I think that everyone in this room believes that George Bush is a mass murderer. But the more important and question that I have is that is it possible to expand the culpability and the evidence of complicity to the military-industrial complex and also the globalist bankers that are behind a lot that's going on in this country?
Only if you could show that they participated in taking this nation to war under false pretenses. If they were part of that, yes. If they weren't, no. It's as simple as that. Were they part of the lie to the American people to get them to give
given the fact that
the president their support for going to war? Were they a part of that? If they were, yes, you could bring them in.
Well, the neoconservatives had written the project for the new American century years before 9/11 even happened.
But that had nothing to do with false pretenses. That was just talking about what they wanted to do, right? And they can have zany ideas. That doesn't make them criminals. This whole thing is taking the nation.
They wrote the Patriot Act also
Pardon?
They wrote the Patriot Act 2 years before 9/11. Okay. So.
Well, you have to show
that is.
See, false pretenses negate self-defense. If you're acting in self-defense, you don't tell lies. If you're acting truly in you don't have to. You tell the truth. This guy is about to attack us, and we have to beat him to the punch. You don't have to lie. When you start telling lies, you're not talking self-defense. I think that one thing is something that's kind of implicit and people are wondering about is this jurisdiction thing. Let me just elaborate on that. If you were to ask me, what is the likelihood that Bush is going to be prosecuted for first-degree murder? I don't know any more than you do. I would probably say there's not a high probability. However, I definitely believe there's a substantial possibility that because of this book, he's going to end up in an American courtroom being prosecuted for murder. Now, why do I say that? Now, here's why I say that. Here's why I say that. It's because of the great number of prosecutors that I've established jurisdiction for in this book. Spent many, many, many hours at the LA County Law Library, Ninth Circuit Library, establishing jurisdiction. He can be prosecuted for 2 crimes, conspiracy to commit murder and murder. On a federal level, from a practical standpoint, we're only talking about one prosecutor, the Attorney General in Washington, D.C., operating through his Department of Justice. Theoretically, there's 93 U.S. attorneys throughout the land. We have one here in L.A. I think San Diego has one. I think San Francisco has one. They could do it, but they're not going to do it without getting the consent of their boss in Washington, D.C. So we're really only talking about, on a federal level, one prosecutor. But on a state level, I've established jurisdiction for the Attorney General in each of the 50 states, plus the 950 district attorneys in counties within those states to prosecute Bush for the murder of any soldier or soldiers who died fighting his war in Iraq who came from their state or county. Now, with all those prosecutors out there, okay, 1,000 prosecutors, and with all the evidence of guilt that I lay out in this book, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that there's at least one prosecutor out there, maybe many more, who's going to be courageous enough to step forward and say, hey, this is the United States of America. In America, no man is above the law. The evidence of guilt is clear. I'm going to go after George Bush and bring about justice for the American people. That's not completely unreasonable to believe. I also want to put the thought in his mind for the rest of his life. You know, Pinochet, 33 years later, they came after him for murder, right? Yeah. Okay. I want to put the thought in George Bush's mind. If this is the only thing that I can do, when he's down there at the ranch with Barney or whatever it is, he's never going to know for sure whether some aide's going to tap him on the shoulder someday and say, Mr. President, there's this prosecutor up in Fargo, North Dakota. I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's like Milosevic or Polosevic or something like that. But Mr. President, he's charging you with murder, and we're doing Fargo Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock for the arraignment. He's never going to know that. I want to put that thought in his mind. That's the least that I can do.
If we successfully prosecute him for murder, is it possible to expand the culpability to his cabinet and all the rest of those
If they were a party
criminals?
to it, of course. And I think it would be improbable, not just improbable, impossible that he went to war without the assistance and the knowledge of Cheney and Rice at a minimum. Probably Rove. I don't know about Rumsfeld, and I told you I'm not sure about Powell. But Rove probably is up over his head. Rove.
What about Dick Cheney?
Oh, Cheney. I didn't say Cheney. I'm sorry. Cheney and Rice, of course.
Well, thanks.
And if the prosecutor is seeking the death penalty for all three of them, you can expect these moral weaklings, okay, to be getting down on their hands and knees and begging the prosecutor to give them a break, life imprisonment, to testify against Bush. If they had no if they had no hesitancy about taking this nation to war under false pretense, or if they're that devoid of morality, certainly they will testify against Bush on their own hide. You can almost guarantee you that, okay? And the prosecutor's going to have to be worried about, you know, to get a better deal. Are they embroidering their story? But you see, Bush can't get a plea bargain. Plea bargains are not for the stick-up guy. They're for the driver of the getaway car, okay? He's the stick-up guy. And they could probably tell us things about Bush that would make our hair, I don't have any, but our hair curl, okay? And it may come down to that. If they know that there's a chance they could end up in the electric chair, we're going to find out a lot more than we already know.
Is Rove the getaway guy?
Well, Rove is not the main guy. The main guy is Bush.
Yeah.
Rove is the type of guy that would be on his hands and knees because he's a moral weakling and a coward. He's devoid of all morality. He would be begging the prosecutor, see, now, listen, as I told you, Bush would sing any aria, is that the way you pronounce the word? Any aria the prosecutor wanted, but the prosecutor would not be interested in his songs. Only people like Rove, Cheney, Rice, and he may not even listen to them. He may feel he has enough evidence to get the death penalty against them. But if there's any weakness in his case, then he would be expected to give some type of plea bargain to people like Rove, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Rice, but not George Bush. This guy has to end up you know where.
Absolutely.
If there's anything called justice in America, he's got to end up you know where.
Yep. Thanks for your patriotism, man. It's awesome. Thank you.
It would greatly dishonor the memory of those in their graves right now if he were not to pay the ultimate penalty.
Absolutely.
But that's all up to the jury. I'm not saying this now. Well, I'm saying it, but I'm saying I want a jury to decide what the proper punishment is. And I want a jury to decide whether he's guilty or not guilty of murder. Okay. That's what we do in America. That's America. Yes.
Yes, on the Manning memo,
Right.
how and why was it released? And
Why was it what?
Declassified. How did it come about? How did it become known about this?
Well, it first came out in a book by this fellow Philip Sands in England a couple years ago. That's the first time that it came out. How he saw the memo, I don't know. Since that time, the New York Times has seen the entire memo. I don't know how they got it, but they've seen the entire memo.
And if the provocation wasn't actually acted upon, how much can you use that provocation that was in that memo for your case?
His state of mind.
Okay.
He's telling America and the world that Hussein's an imminent threat to the security of this country, so we have to strike first in self-defense or he's going to attack us. And behind closed doors, he's talking about how to provoke Hussein into a war. Those are two inconsistent positions. I think you agree with me on that, don't you?
Yes, that's what confuses me, too.
I'm glad. 'Cause I'm wondering, yeah.
Sir, first I'd like to thank Arlene Proctor for bringing you to us.
Yes.
Thank you so much. You know, it's so easy for us to become numb to the obvious, and it's thanks to clear-minded, articulate people like you that gives us 2020 again. And I just wanted to say for the record that I applaud you for your courage, for your clear thinking, and when they want to know what a real patriot looks like, that's what a real patriot looks like.
I keep hearing from people how courageous. I am not a courageous guy. I keep hearing that. That's nonsense. I'm motivated strictly by anger in this case.
If Bush attacks Iran, will that give you more ammunition?
It's a hypothetical. I can't answer it. I'm not even studying the Iran issue. I got enough on my plate right here.
Okay.
I see Iran in the headlines. I don't even read it. I'm sorry. I'm up over my head on this 7 days a week. I want to see this guy in an American courtroom being prosecuted for murder.
I have to make a comment to you with the utmost respect. For years, since September 11th, you have been the only person who has come up with the jurisdiction of using the U.S. federal courts and the state courts for the prosecution of George Walker Bush. You have laid the case to bring down this president as soon as he walks out on January 21st of 2009, and I have spoken to Congressman Conyers personally. Congressman Wexler's know about your books, and I have said vehemently about that you have laid out the case and that the law has always been on our side, and you are the one that came out with all the criminal things that can be brought out against this president. So you should be heralded for your tenacity.
Listen, I'm very, very honored by what you said. I'm deeply honored by that. And because of you, I think, Conyers called me yesterday. I had a half-hour conversation with him. He's completely behind what I'm doing here.
That's right.
Apparently, we can just have a couple more questions because I'm supposed to sign books? Okay, apparently there's only a couple more questions. She's going to throw me off the stage, okay? Okay, 1 and 2 then, okay?
I just want to make a quick comment that I think that you can see from looking out here. You may have been blacked out in the big media, but I heard you twice already. I heard you on Amy Goodman. I heard you on Ian Masters. That almost all of us have already heard everything that you have to say on KPFK, and we came here to hear more. And you need to just reach out to all the blogs and the internet and the Air America.
I'm starting to get on them. I was speaking about the mainstream media. It's totally
we don't need them. Forget them. Fuck them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. You people are wonderful. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can George Bush pardon his cabinet for crimes before they're actually prosecuted for those crimes?
Well, yeah. He can prosecute anyone who's committed a crime in the past. I mean, he can pardon, yeah. He can't pardon himself.
So he can pardon his whole cabinet before leaving office?
Yeah, he could.
Even before they're actually prosecuted for those crimes?
Yeah,
Yes.
Those are the 2 questions, I guess. I just want to say this in closing, that for those of you who want America to one day be the great nation it once was, it can hardly do that unless it brings those responsible for the war in Iraq to justice. Those who are responsible have been brought to justice. So I want to thank all of you so very, very much for coming here. It heartens me tremendously that I have all this support. I wish all of you the very best of luck in all the years ahead. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Vincent, let me ask, Vincent, on Second Thought Television, I'd like, for the European audience I'm taping for, why not invoke the common law jury application in the private attorney general? Then we, the people, can indict them, and we don't have to wait for any prosecutor. We could start the indictment this year. Why not invoke private attorney general on a certified warrant?
By law, it's got to be the Attorney General in Washington, the State Attorney General, or the DA. Private citizens cannot get together and start prosecuting. It can't be done. That's not common law, maybe, back in 14th century England, but we're not today. Only a duly constituted authority. The people cannot get together. The people can put pressure on the DA and the State Attorney General, but the people themselves cannot bring a criminal action. They could bring a civil action.
Doesn't the Constitution
And let's bring that pressure, right? We have an Attorney General, Jerry Brown. When I saw him about a week ago at the California Democratic Party Executive Board meeting, I said, Jerry, tell me you've read Vincent Bugliosi's book. And he said, what book? I know Vince, but what book? And I said, you've got to read the prosecution of George Bush for murder tonight. So I would suggest that all of us get on the phone, write to Jerry Brown, write to every prosecutor in the state, and urge them to get to work. Because we the people deserve better than what is going on right now in this country, and we must stop it before it expands to Iran. Vincent Bugliosi is going to be signing books in the back. On behalf of Progressive Democrats of Los Angeles, Progressive Democrats of America, and all of the co-sponsors, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Anthony.
In his career as a prosecutor for the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, Vincent Bugliosi was successful in 105 out of 106 felony jury trials, including 21 consecutive murder convictions. He prosecuted Charles Manson and the Manson family for a series of California murders and wrote a book about it called Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson murders. Mr. Bugliosi's other books include Outrage, The 5 Reasons Why O.J. Simpson Got Away with Murder, The Betrayal of America, How the Supreme Court Undermined the Constitution and Chose Our President, and Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. For more on Vincent Bugliosi and his new book, visit prosecutionofbush.com.
Well, the National Governors Association turns 100 years old